So we have a couple do's and don'ts for our dot notation. What's this going to return? Again, these green question marks mean that I want someone. I want a victim to answer. Don't all yell it all out at once. Undefined. Yeah, there we go. Great. What about this one?
Material.
What is it?
Material.
Material?
Cardboard.
Oh no. This is also undefined.
Yeah, undefined.
No?
Why is this one undefined?
Because it always thinks key as a string rather than it's a key value key pair, so key value pairs take it as a key rather than value.
Absolutely. So the reason this is undefined is because the dot notation is equivalent to using the bracket notation with the quotes. So the first two lines are looking up the same thing. They're looking up a property called key on the object box, which doesn't exist, so it's undefined.
So if you wanted cardboard, you would do the brackets without the quotes, K-E-Y without the quotes in the bracket notation.
Absolutely. Oops, where's my thing? So what's this one?
Cardboard.
Cardboard. Very good. Cool. So here's some do's and don'ts. Don't use dot notation with a variable. Don't use quotations around your variable. It's going to give you some undesired results. Yeah, if you have a variable, just put it in there without the quotes. So what about some non-valid characters and numbers and things? So with dot notation, you have to use valid variable names. When I mean valid variable names, I don't mean a variable name. I mean something that if you type it up in your console here, that can everyone see this? If I said like var 0 equals ASDF, that won't work because numbers aren't valid variable names. So that means that for our object, if we said box.0, equals something, that's also not going to work. So if you can't say var whatever it is, then that's considered an invalid variable name, and you cannot use it with dot notation. So some things other than numbers that are invalid are just weird characters. And the way that we get around this, if you have to use them, is by using the bracket notation with quotation marks. Unless it's a number, in which case quotation marks are optional. But for example, here we have this really semantic name here, upper caret ampersand star. I name most of my properties like this. It's for readability purposes. And so that's how we deal with non-valid characters, numbers, things like that. And then also, if we want to access them, it's the same way. We have to keep those quotations around it with the bracket notation. Cool, and here's a picture of what our object kind of looks like. And notice that our numbers, even though we pass it in as a number, it's actually stored as a string. Under the hood, whenever you use bracket notation, it's actually stringifying. Once it evaluates the expression, it's going to stringify those values, even if it's a number. Even if it's an array or a function as well, because those are our objects under the hood.
Are single quotes equivalent to double quotes in all these places?
Yes. Yeah. Quotations are super flexible as long as they match. Cool. So here are the rules kind of laid out. So as we can see, bracket notation's a lot more powerful than dot notation. Dot notation, you can really only put strings in there. I mean, remember, those strings have to be valid variable names, which means they can't be numbers, they can't have weird characters, they can't be expressions like math or a function. You can't put quotations around it. For brackets, You can do pretty much anything. Some things do need quotes. I have a little key here. So if it has this key here, that means it requires quotes. So if you want a string, it has to have quotes. If you want to do anything with a weird character, you require the quotes as well, and then variables, numbers, and expressions without the quotation marks. Cool? Mm-hmm.
If you pass in a function in the brackets, does it have to return a string?
It should return a string.
Okay.
Whatever it returns is going to be stringified. The danger with, I don't know why you would really, I don't know, maybe you would put a function. I've never put a function in bracket notation, but if you don't call the function, then it's just going to basically like stringify your function. So if you say like var x equals function, it's just going to say like x.to string, and then it's going to do a property lookup on something that looks like function with quotation marks. So make sure that you actually call your function. If you must do that, but I wouldn't recommend it. It was more of an example of that you can do that because it evaluates expressions in those brackets.
But does it stringify in the brackets, like if it's a number? Mm-hmm. So anything, it gets stringified?
Yep.
Got it.
Yep.
Is there any special string interpolation rules for single versus double quotes? Some languages, single quotes is just a string literal.
No, it doesn't matter.
So you can.
Could be, yeah, it could be anything. Yeah, it really doesn't matter. You guys are really into the quotations today. So many quotes. Cool. All right. So those are the rules. Any questions about these rules? And really, really important about these rules is that they don't change. So like I was saying before, everything in JavaScript's an object, and because they're objects, these object rules for the syntax stay the same. So keep that in mind. Whenever you see dot notation, wherever you see bracket notation, just remember these rules, and they're always going to be the same. One last thing I want to talk about objects is storing data. So as I mentioned briefly before, we can store anything in our object. So here we have, on I guess the second line here, we're storing a string, but we can also store an object, and then we can also store functions. When we store functions as a property on an object, we call it a method. I'm not sure why we have to do that, but that's what we do. And yeah. Any questions about that?
Can you say that again? Elaborate.
Elaborate. So this slide is just showing that we can store all kinds of any data in JavaScript. So any data type. So we have strings, you can store numbers, you can store booleans, you can store undefined, null. You can also store functions and objects. And when we store a function as a property on an object, we call that a method. So if you hear the term method thrown around and function thrown around, just know that they're the same thing pretty much, except that a method is just a property on an object that's a function. That's the only difference. But if you really think about it, in the browser, everything's attached to the window object, so you could kind of say that everything's a method, but maybe I'm taking that too far.
So area here is the method.
Yeah, area is the method.
Got it.
Mm-hmm. Cool.
And in the function part of your lecture, are you going to get into the whole when is the difference between a function and a method and all that stuff, or?
I mean, yeah, I'll talk about it. I mean, the difference between a function and method is there's no difference.
Okay.
Yeah. Like as far as like how you use them, the only thing, it's just a vocab word really, that a method is a function that's a property of an object. So if you say like an array has a method, that just means the array has a function, like array.push, right? And we put the two parentheses on the side, that means that it's a function. Yeah, that's all. Cool. And then just like some styles, a lot of people say, so you can do bracket, you can do dots. When would you use one versus the other? And it really doesn't matter, again, at your job or if you're contributing to open source, if they have a style guide, of course, follow their guidelines. For me, I always use dot notation unless it's a variable or an odd character, just simply because it's shorter to type and it's just easier. So in general, I just use dots unless I need to do something with an expression, like evaluate a variable or something like that. Cool. All right, so just going back up to a slide. So we have like two different ways to look at the object, right? We have this sort of a notation to the, I don't know if that's left or right, to the side. And then we have this notation where we're dynamically adding properties. So this one right here is called object literal notation. I'm going to talk about how to translate one from the other. So first, again, we're going to start with how we had it. We have this object literal that's empty. And then we expand out that bracket. And so now that we have everything inside of our object, we can lose the reference to box, right? Because it's inside. So we take off box. We don't need the brackets either. And then we aren't assigning anything. We're just setting it. So we have some colons. And then we added a comma. And then we're going to take out that semicolon and put it and keep it at the end. And so that's sort of the walkthrough on how to go from object literal notation, or I'm sorry, from dynamically adding properties and values to an object to object literal notation, which you've probably seen both of them by now. And the important thing here is that property names, in this case, are always going to be strings. They're not going to be expressions. But you can put an expression as the value. Cool. Any questions about that? Sort of the different syntax. And also, in this case, we don't even need to have quotations. Since it's going to be assumed that size is a string, we don't need quotes. However, if we're going to have something with funny characters like this, you're going to need to keep those quotes around there because it'll confuse your interpreter. Cool. And then we can still use our dot bracket notation, still the same, even if we're using object literal notation. It's just a different way of writing it. Cool. Any questions? I'm going to wait for just like one question. So if someone could just ask me a question, we can move on.
When teams are working, they come to agreement on which way to do things based on a style guide, or how do you do that?
Yeah, I mean, there might be a style guide. I don't know if it'll be as in depth, but as far as like when you should use object literal notation versus like adding properties dynamically, it kind of depends on your data and how you're getting it. So if your data is going to change, for example, like after runtime, it might make sense to store in a variable and add it dynamically, especially if the property names could be different. So if it's going to change after runtime, you would probably want to use the bracket or dot notation. But if it's something that's static and it's just an object that you have and that data doesn't change, then you could just put in object literal notation and call it a day, you know. So now we're going to talk about iteration. We talked about adding things and taking things out. What about if we want to just like loop through the entire object and get out those values and take a look at that property? So,
A question came up in the chat room. If size is a string, but you assign it a value that's a number, does it become an integer?
wait, one more time?
If size is a string, but then you assign it a value that's a number, does it then become an integer? Or
Right, so are we talking about here?
right.
This is a number.
Right, but if that were to be a string there, I think they're asking then if you were to assign it
Like
to a
this?
number, does it? Right.
No, then it would just be a string that happens to have a number, a character that's a number inside.
I think the question he's asking is, if you set it as a string and then later you set that same property to an integer, it will change its type.
Absolutely.
However,
Oh yeah, yeah,
I
it
think
will
that's what
change.
he's asking.
Yeah, so if you if we said box.size, so we set it here as 9, and then we said box.size equals 9, or whatever, you know, whatever. Then when we said like type of box.size, that would return, you know, it would return string. Does that answer the question?
Yep.
Okay, so back to looping. So we want to loop through our object and look at what's inside. And so we have a handy, what should I call this? We have a loop. We have a for-in loop, and this loop is special for objects, which is great because everything in JavaScript's an object, so it works for almost anything. So here we have a loop that is looping through our box. Some key words here for our loop, for this particular loop. There's tons of different loops, and well, there's like 6 different loops or so in JavaScript, but this one in particular, there's 2 key words to keep in mind. We have for, and then we have in, and that's why I call this the for-in loop. And then we also have this var key, which is a variable that we just create. And this key, or in this variable, is going to hold the value of the property name always. And that's just the way that this loop works. And then the other important thing to keep in mind is where we have box, and that's going to hold reference to our object in which we're looping through, right? So we have our box up here, and we're looping through here in this box. And so knowing what we know about this loop, what do we think this console log is going to return for us?
Material, 0, 20 characters.
0. You mean you can't pronounce this? I think it's pronounced
Carrera.
I think that's how you say it. Yeah. Cool. So it's going to log our property names. Cool. So what if we wanted to?
Not necessarily in that order.
Yeah, not necessarily in that order. There's no guaranteed order in an object, so it will come out however.
What's a little confusing there is that, so is key like a kind of reserved word, or could you have called it anything?
Nope, we could call it anything. It's just a variable.
Right, okay, so it's not like, yeah, as long as it's consistent.
Yeah, and so we tend to say key or prop, but that's just a convention. It doesn't actually mean anything. I usually just call it cow in my code. Just kidding, I don't.
Would it still be valid if you did the variable declaration outside of the for expression there? Okay, it just passes the variable.
Cool.
Now, why is that on the key and not on the value? So why isn't it? How does it know that cow is referring to the key?
Because that's just how the loop is. So that variable, whatever variable you put here before the n,
okay,
is going to be the key.
The key. And so you use dot or bracket or whatever for the value, if you wanted to loop out cardboard, meow, and testing.
Totally. And that would be my next question. Let's see, who here is really shy? I'm going to pick on you. What about you? Look particularly shy this morning. If we wanted to print out the value, so just like Rich in the front row said, if we wanted to print out the value, how would we do that? So if you wanted to do cardboard, meow, testing 1, 2, 3, how would we do that?
You're asking me, right?
Yeah, I'm asking you.
Yeah, I don't know. I was literally just playing around with that, trying to get that exact same thing here in my editor. I don't know.
Cool. That's fair. What about you over there?
Box bracket, call bracket.
Cool. So, whoops. So box, bracket, cow. Will that work?
Yep.
What about this? What about purple shirt front row? Is that going to work?
Yes.
Why?
Because bracket is the same as dot.
It's close, except for when.
When it's not.
Yeah, when it's not.
It's not.
Yeah. Except for when it's a variable or a special character or a number. So in this case, actually, cow is a variable. We can see that here, actually, when we say var cow. We see that that's a variable. So in this case, actually, we can only use bracket notation for it to work. Thumbs on that? Everyone's gonna have their thumbs. Thumbs in the chat room. So a B, lowercase b is thumb up, and a P is thumb down. I don't know. Chat room doesn't like.
We have a question in the chat room.
Sure.
In this for loop, he was just asking if you should be checking box.hasOwnProperty before logging it.
Yeah. And that's why when we get to our functional programming, we're going to talk about looping using underscore and why it's better, because you don't have to do a check like that. But yeah, that's a good point. Cool.
Bianca? In that second assignment, box, bracket 0, I'm still struggling with that. What is that actually doing again?
This one here?
Yeah.
Yeah. So what that's doing is it is creating a property 0. And so you're passing it in there. 0 is a number, so you don't need to put quotes around it. But underneath, it's going to be running 2 strings. So you can kind of imagine it to say like this.
So it's not looking at a 0th index and returning that material property? That's what I'm struggling with.
Sort of like you're thinking of like an array.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, it's different. And then also with an array, we'll talk about that in after the first exercise. That these things still work for arrays, and that the 0th property in an array is actually just a property name. It actually isn't really paying attention to the fact that it's the first one or not. It's actually like 0, value, in this case meow. But yeah, it has nothing to do with the order.
They're just asking if you could explain again why dot notation wouldn't work for that console.log.
Sure, yeah, so dot notation wouldn't work because key is a variable name. And since it's a variable, we have to always use bracket notation because we want our interpreter to look up that variable instead of just using it as a string. So if I did put quotes around it, what would happen is we're looking for a property now called key on box, not the variable. And so the variable key in this case, in this loop, is going to hold different property names for all the property names in the object each time. So this object has 3 properties, so it's going to loop 3 times. And every time key is going to hold the value of the property name. So the first time it might hold material, the second time it might hold 0, but it's going to be stringified 0 actually. And then the third time it's going to hold, that's how you pronounce this third one, I think. My accent's kind of off, but yeah.
Do you use the var on the for loop, since it already knows that's the key?
You should always use var because it keeps it from being a global variable. Yeah. But it wouldn't break it if you didn't do it, but it might interfere with other. If you have a bunch of for-in loops and they all have key and they're all global, it could do some weird things, potentially. Yeah. Cool. Sure.
I actually get 3 undefineds when I run that.
Oh, really? Oh, with the quotes around it?
Yes.
Yeah, because we don't have a property key at in the box. So the quotes around it is an example of how you shouldn't do it.
All right.
So without the quotes is an example of how you should do it.
Great.
But yeah. Why do you think that there's 3 undefines though?
Because it's going through each property.
Totally.
Each one's in.
And even though we're not doing anything with those properties, it's still going to loop 3 times, even though you're looking up that quotes.
Because well, it doesn't know if there is one called key, so it's got to go through it to look for it.
It's just going to loop, no matter what, it's going to loop 3 times, because that's just the mechanics of the loop. It's going to loop through all of the properties on the object. Cool.
So you're iterating all the properties, but you're always looking for the same thing.
Right,
You're always looking for key.
but if we're looking for key in quotes, how does that loop know that there isn't?
The loop doesn't know anything.
Right, so it
Yeah.
goes and it goes to the first property and it checks to see if that one is quote key and
Right.
it says undefined. So
You're
it
not-
has
you're
to
not-
it has to iterate until it finds something.
Right, but you're not comparing for key. You're just iterating all the properties and you're going to do something with whatever that property
Yeah,
is.
whatever you're doing
Oh, okay,
in
got
this
it.
block,
Got
whatever
it.
you're doing in this block, the
So
loop
whether
doesn't
she-
know about it. It
Whether
doesn't
she
care
called
about
it quote key or quote hello world wouldn't have mattered.
Right.
Yeah. Cool. Sweet. Oh. Any more questions? Sure.
I think that another question, are you also using bracket notation because one of the properties is a number, or is it just because of the variable?
Just because of the variable. Just because of the variable. Because again, just one last thing, if we put quotes around it, or we use dot key, it's going to it's only going to be looking for a property called key on the object, which we don't have, right? And that's why we need to have the brackets.